Welcome to another episode of Questions for History. I'm not here to rewrite, reimagine, or recreate. I'm just here to simply ask a question that tells a story. On today's episode of Questions, we ask 5 questions to the Morant Bay Rebellion. The first question we ask is the what, the when, the where, and how does it affect society today? The Morant Bay Rebellion took place October 1865 in the parish of St. Thomas, Eastern, during a time when the island was still under British colonial rule. Although slavery had officially been abolished in 1834, the decades that followed did not bring meaningful economic or political freedom to the formerly enslaved population. Instead, the majority of black population remained trapped in poverty, with limited access to land, justice, or political representation. The roots of the rebellion lied in the systematic inequality. After emancipation, land ownership remained concentrated in the hands of white plantation elites. Freed black Jamaicans were forced to rent land at high prices or work for low wages under conditions not far from removed from slavery. At the same time, the colonial government imposed heavy taxes, including poll taxes, which disproportionately affected the poor. Black Jamaicans were excluded from voting due to property requirements, effectively silencing their political voice. Tensions escalated when a man was arrested for trespassing on an abandoned plantation, an incident that symbolized the injustice of land distribution. This event triggered protests led by Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon and a community leader from Stony Gut. Bogle organized a march to the Morant Bay Courthouse on October 11th, 1865, where protesters demanded justice and fair treatment. The protests turned violent. After clashes with local authorities, several officials were killed, and this gave the colonial government justification, at least in its own view, to respond with extreme force. Governor Edward Eyre declared martial law and unleashed a brutal crackdown. Over 400 black Jamaicans were killed, hundreds were flogged, and more than 1,000 homes were burned. Paul Bogle himself was captured and executed. The importance of the Morant Bay Rebellion today lies in what it reveals about power, justice, and resistance. It expressed how systems of oppression can persist even after formal liberation, and how demands for basic rights can be met with violent repression. It also forced Britain to confront the moral consequences of its colonial rule, sparking national debate and eventually leading to changes. Today, the rebellion is remembered not as a riot, but as a turning point in the struggle for justice and equality in Jamaica. Now that we're over our first obstacle, we know the when, the why, the where, and what happened. We know that there was a protest that led to civil unrest, and we know that the government took drastic actions. We know that it happened on Wednesday, October 11, 1865. We know where it happened, in Morant. So let's examine the second question: background to the conflict, and who are the major players who took part in this conflict. To understand the Morant Bay Rebellion, you have to go way back to the structure of Jamaican society after emancipation. The abolition of slavery did not dismantle the plantation economy. It simply transformed it. The same elites who had owned enslaved people continued to dominate land, wealth, and political institutions. This created a deeply unequal society where race and class were tightly linked. The majority of Black Jamaicans lived in rural areas with limited access to fertile land. Many were forced into exploitative labor arrangements or struggled to survive on marginal plots. The colonial legal system was also biased, often favoring white landowners and punishing Black Jamaicans harshly for minor offenses. Courts were seen not as a place of justice, but as a tool of control. Religion and community leadership played a key role in organizing resistance. Baptist churches, in particular, became the center of political awareness and mobilization. This is where figures like Paul Bogle emerged, not just as religious leaders, but as advocates for social justice. Bogle was closely connected to George William Gordon, a mixed-race politician and critic of colonial policies. Gordon used his position in Jamaican Assembly to speak out against injustice, particularly the treatment of poor in St. Thomas. He supported Bogle's effort and helped amplify the grievances of the people. On the opposing side was Governor Edward Eyre, the British appointed leader of Jamaica. Eyre believed that the maintaining order required strict control, and he viewed the growing unrest as a threat to colonial stability. His responses to the rebellion would define his legacy and spark controversy in Britain. The conflict, therefore, was not just between protesters and authorities, it was a clash between two visions of society. One, demanding fairness and inclusion, and another, determined to preserve hierarchy and control. Now that we have established the background to the conflict, simply put, slave society was still active. The elites were still controlling society. Black people in Jamaica had no land, had nowhere to plant, no ground provisions. There was a drought going on. Diseases were breaking out, smallpox, and all that. We know that some of the major players were Governor Edward Eyre, Paul Bogle, and George William Gordon. But now let's examine the third question. What escalated the conflict? The Morant Bay Rebellion did not just erupt suddenly. It escalated through a series of tensions that had been building for years. Economic hardship, legal injustice, and political exclusion created an environment where frustration was widespread and deeply felt. One major factor was the failure of the colonial government to address repeated complaints from the black population. Petitions were ignored, grievances dismissed, and conditions remained unchanged. This created a sense that peaceful methods of seeking justice were ineffective. The immediate escalation began with the arrest of a black man for trespassing on land that many believe should have been accessible to the poor in the first place. When supporters attempted to intervene, they were also arrested. This incident became symbolic. It was no longer about one man, but about a system that criminalized survival of its people. Paul Bogle responded by organizing a march to Morant Bay. Importantly, this march was not initially intended to be violent. It was a demonstration, a direct appeal to authority. When tensions were high and protesters encountered the local militia, the situation quickly spiraled. The presence of armed forces escalated fear and aggression. A confrontation led to gunfire, which triggered chaos. Once blood was shed, the colonial government framed the event as a rebellion rather than a protest. This framing justified the declaration of martial law. Governor Ayre's decision to impose martial law was the final escalation. It transformed a localized protest in a full-scale military crackdown where normal and legal protections were suspended and extreme force was authorized. We are aware, now that we are aware that the conflict was escalated due in part to complaints being ignored, frustration, hunger, petty arrests. But now let's establish the fourth question. What were the key moments, decision, and turning point Several key moments defined the trajectory of the Morant Bay Rebellion. The first was the march itself. When Paul Bogle and his followers walked to Morant Bay, they were making a statement. This was a public demand for justice, not a hidden uprising. That moment marked the transition from quiet suffering to open resistance. The second turning point was a confrontation at the courthouse. When the violence broke out and officials were killed, the narrative of the event shifted drastically. What could have remained a protest was now labeled a rebellion, giving authorities justification to respond with force. The most significant decision came from Governor Edward Ayre. His declaration of martial law allowed the military to operate without restraint. This decision effectively removed legal protection from the population and opened the door to widespread violence. Another major turning point was the execution of George William Gordon, Although he was not directly involved in the violence, he was arrested, transferred to a martial law zone, and executed. This act shocked many in Britain and became a focal point of criticism against Eyre. Finally, the scale of the crackdown itself was a turning point. The destruction of villages and the mass killings were not just acts of suppression, they were acts meant to instill fear. But instead, they sparked outrage internationally and forced a re-evaluation of colonial governance. Let's conclude our topic. We saw where silence shift into action. We saw a march turn into a protest. We saw the protests by the courthouse turning into a riot. We saw the execution of George William Gordon and the outrage it caused across the land. Let's now examine what were the impact, consequences of the Morant Rebellion. Journey with me. The consequences of the Morant Rebellion were immediate, far-reaching, and deeply transformative. And deeply transformative. On a human level, the impact was devastating. Hundreds of lives were lost, families were destroyed, and entire communities were left in ruins. The psychological impact of such violence cannot be overstated. It reinforced fear, trauma, and the risk of resistance. Politically, the rebellion led to the end of Jamaica's limited self-governance. In 1866, Jamaica became a crown colony, meaning it was governed directly by Britain rather than through a local assembly. While this reduced the power of the local elite, it also removed what little political representation existed for the population. In Britain, the rebellion sparked intense debate. Governor Eyre was both condemned and defended at the same time. Some saw him as a protector of order, while others viewed him as responsible for all these atrocities. This debate exposed the moral contradictions of the British Empire. Economically, the underlying issues of land and inequality were not immediately resolved. However, the rebellion forced attention onto these problems and contributed to long-term discussions about reform. In modern Jamaica, the legacy of the rebellion is one of resistance and national identity. Paul Bogle is recognized now as a national hero, and the event it is seen as a critical moment in the struggle for justice. He, alongside George William Gordon, has now been national heroes of Jamaica. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like, share, or remember to comment. You can subscribe to Next Vibration Entertainment for more in the episodes of Questions in History. I'm out.